We're back, and we had a great conversation in our breakout room that involved Eileen Miles. And a poem that's hanging on my wall. And I was thinking of, in one of the pieces I read of yours this week, you were talking about the importance of not necessarily like concentrating on everything, but the thing that comes in from the side and just kind of blows it up is the thing that you need to kind of like, and it's literally on the side. So we can talk about that maybe a little bit later, but now's the time to raise your hand or type up in the chat and we will conduct a Q&A. So we get the participants list up. And I guess like Brooke and Els, maybe check the participants if I don't see it.
I'm so curious about this poem now.
Have you read this poem called I Am Ann Lee?
No.
Oh, okay. Well, we did a small dramatic reading of it, but it's from Eileen Miles's book, Evolution. And we're thinking about the question of creation that you brought up at the end, but I was also thinking about this moment in the beginning of the talk where you talk about the death of the child as the worst narcissistic injury, and that there might be some sort of extreme grief from the pandemic and other sort of moments of death and loss that we're either confronting or we're not confronting. I think you said there's something about that. And so we were thinking about the loss of a child and what that might mean in terms of like the idea of creation and conversion. But then in this poem, which I suppose I won't read the whole thing, but it is actually quite interesting, the ways in which like Eileen Miles's voice kind of undercuts Ann Lee and this founder of Shaker religion. And she talks about how the Shakers were celibate and how did they reproduce? Well, they generated by like adopting. And Eileen Miles says she hasn't had sex since February in this poem, and talks about how she has sex, but she loves that this world, this Shaker world, is created by a different kind of generative way of being. And there's a way in which, like, as she's talking about a different kind of generation or creation, maybe conversion, the voice of the poet is also undercutting that non-sexual creation with a kind of a sexuality that keeps her voice is, she's kind of like very obviously saying like, I haven't had sex, but I do have sex and I like to have sex kind of thing. This weird kind of way in which it's getting kind of undercut. And so that was our conversation about the Eileen Miles poem. And I apologize that that's not actually a question formulated, which is my job is to make sure people don't ask questions like that, but yeah. And Angelo, who is my partner in our chat, kind of, or Angelo, if you wanted to, maybe you want to speak a little bit about the reel and what you had kind of brought up.
Yeah, well, what I found myself associating to when Alana was talking about that voice that comes in through the side was how Lacan talks about the real. And I wonder, Jamieson, any thoughts that you have about how you see the real kind of impacting this conversation around the analyzing the cause of desire, and the kind of jump-starting, the reanimating of that system that's maybe gotten too burdened with the symbolic.
It's interesting because it sometimes can be seen as in both directions, that there's too much real, right, which is its own kind of burden, or it's too elided in terms of, like the sort of overly symbolic nature. And there is something about the conversion hysteria or conversion in general, the hysterical kind of symptomatology that speaks on both sides. I mean, there's a lot of real in terms of the somatic presentations, but there's also an excess of the symbolic that then, you know, as an analyst, you start cutting through that. And you're working with the repression that's already in place in order to find the right balance, as it were, although I don't like the word balance so much, but to find the space rather, that something can move in another direction. And you can look at anxiety as too much real, and you can look at obsessionality as too much symbolic, right? So it's interesting that on the way that Freud has it kind of mapped out in the phylogenetic fantasy paper, right? He has them on these different directions. So obsessionality, you have to hystericize, but you also have to hystericize anxiety, and they're two totally different directions in treatment.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Lily, do you have a question?
Hi. Yeah, I do. I wanted to talk about two things which are like a bit related, but the first thing was this interest in conversion as a kind of radical physicality. And I was intrigued when you were talking about war as a kind of conversion. I think there was a time at which you said transvaluation of values. And I'm very interested in how, I think I've been trying to think through this in terms of a property logics, especially given the protests, riots, events over the summer. And I wonder about the a kind of conversion of property back into objects or out of a capitalist system. I wonder about that as a potential for conversion, and if that is something that you're sort of referring to in some of those discussions about value, or if that could be a thing. And then the other question is, I'm wondering about this like psyche-soma split and the, I'm trying to elucidate this, but maybe like repression as a kind of mental thinking that then gets pushed down. And I wonder if conversion is just an expression of the psychic ruminative kind of nature of the body in and of itself. And I wonder how you feel about Freud's sort of mind-body split and this idea that there's this like movement to a disparate organ, as if the brain is not in itself an organ which is already kind of contagiously interacting with all of these other like, I wonder if you, when you're discussing conversion, a physicality of a symptom, if you think of that as a mental phenomenon or as something that could be more diffusely psychic, physically.
I mean, maybe the way to answer it towards the thing, thank you for both of your questions. And maybe they're related, because if we take the second question, it's interesting that the split, right, between psyche and soma, like a lot of people think that you need to translate the hysterical body back into thinking. But I've been interested in the psychoanalysis that doesn't want to do that. And I actually think I find in Lacan and other ways of thinking about hysteria, or even Jean-Luc Nancy in interesting ways, a push against that. And actually people like Monique de Vimenard, who I gave my students to read, and even other Lacanians from that genre, I think really go against that and read into Freud a very different model. And I was trying to also pose that model with the idea that the transformation or the conversion of conversion isn't that you go from psyche to soma back to psyche, right? But that you create a whole nother body entirely. You create a new state altogether, which has to do with neither of those in a way.
So are you saying like you kind of hit it with a physicality that it is presenting itself in that conversion of the conversion?
You push the physicality of it, or the bodily presentation of it, which he says becomes the space of analysis itself. It starts to determine the space and rhythm and thought. So, I mean, he doesn't say that it becomes thought. He said it transforms thought almost into the unconscious as exteriority and the experience of analysis. I mean, it's very strange, but many analysts speak, for example, about transference, which again is a conveyance of something from somewhere else to somewhere else. Right? You transfer onto the analyst, or you transfer into the analysis something. That you're creating actually a third body in some way. You're creating a transferential analytic body that's neither psyche nor soma. And we would have to, I think, with your question, let's say about property or about some other, and this is the question that I left us on. It's like, well, how do you take this psychoanalytic model, something very, very particular, right? That happens between an analyst and a patient with a weird process that we have. How can we use that to think about the world? And I get very dissatisfied with a lot of like applied psychoanalysis, but I think that I kind of ask you guys to work. Like I'll tell you what I understand as an analyst. Like you guys, kind of tell me how we can push this out there. And I think your question about the transformation of property or the transformation of an object by a protest, that maybe there's some way of thinking about that, trying to get out from a system that seems really split, private property or communal property, and try to find a different way in which to think of the object.
Yeah. I wonder if we're all longing for a kind of radical sharing. I mean, obviously we're submerged in that through contagion with COVID, but also if we're longing for a kind of radical sharing, both physically, bodily, and economically, through the transformation of capitalist property into something that's more diffusely spread out and shared, literally.
Yeah, I mean, the various experiments that take place in communal living around the protest sites and like the local kind of specificity of suddenly engaging in a different way of having a body with others, I think is important. And everyone's like, what is this for? Why do they want to, live together like this and annex these spaces? But I think it's about somehow trying to find a different place, or stick your body differently in place, in space. To try to analogize that to a political program is a real problem, in the same way that do that with analysis is also a problem, but nevertheless, you have to support the attempts that are taking place. And recognize the desire, right? As you're saying, a desire for sharing.
Kara Cohen-Gardner asks, a la Sisu, and I think that is in relation to this past question that you were. Kara, would you like to elaborate?
No, I mean, I just was in reference to the third body and creating something entirely new, and how you see that happening. I do have a separate question that's like, do you think that sexual attraction to the analyst is necessary?
I think that understanding transference as sexual is necessary, but then the question of what counts as sexual is complicated, because it doesn't necessarily mean, I don't know, like genital, or even, like it doesn't, the question of what that sexuality is doing in transference, I think is, I think it's so often made stupid by the way psychoanalysis talks about it. Like, I mean, this idea that transference is like, oh, it's your mother, or oh, it's your father, or oh, you want to have sex with your analyst, or oh, I mean, this is just so dumb. Whereas like the intricacy of transference, even in just this way that we're talking about it now, what gets repeated, how the desire is played out, how it's supported, how it's lived out, is just so lost in that banality. And I don't mind it as a popular kind of banality, you know, it's like, oh, the analyst, you know, gonna get turned on. But that I don't mind. I mean, that's just like some excitement about what psychoanalysis makes possible. It's upsetting to me when analysts talk about it this way. Then I wonder what the hell they're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it also speaks to what you were saying about how sex is in everything and has also sort of been taken out of everything. So redefining like what is the sexual relationship outside of the basics. Thank you.
Charles, would you like to ask your question aloud?
Yes, I will. One of the best papers I've read out of the psychiatric literature is called Spiritual Psychotherapy. And one of the things I see missing in what was discussed tonight is the spiritual aspect. And perhaps that says something about psychoanalysis. You know, and someone mentioned down here, I see in the chat, James Hillman. I fully support his connection to trying to help people live in this world. In my opinion, the psychotherapist can only help a person to the degree that they have helped themselves. And so they have to have a spiritual aspect to themselves and be able to help the patient develop that in order to succeed. Now, I speak as a retired family doctor. I'm a dinosaur, right? And my knowledge comes from taking care of patients who came with multiple symptoms that there was no scientific, or at least organic, as we in medicine say, explanation. And it was apparent to me that their problems were from predicaments, from stresses in their lives, be it poverty. They just were checking out. It was demoralization. I think Frank, as a psychiatrist, talked about demoralization, a lack of meaning in people's lives. And the pandemic has really exposed this, what I call soul sickness. And my solution for that is to reconnect people to nature. That's where the real healing is. That's why we get a wound and we heal, because nature knows how to fix it. We're disconnected from nature, and until we correct that, I'm sorry, the highfalutin academia is not going to solve our problems. I love it. I love reading novels. I love literature and the humanities and what they can teach us. But you need to stop talking to each other and talk to people so they understand what you're trying to get across. That's my rant. I'm sorry.
I mean, it's interesting because in some ways I wanted to go back to conversion in terms of its place in religion, but in order to not have such a discontinuity between the religious and the psychoanalytic, but to maybe then also speak to whatever psychoanalysis might have changed with respect to the ways that it tried to answer certain questions that maybe religion couldn't at a certain point anymore. And then to speak to the place where psychoanalysis is failing with respect to the present. The thing about nature is certainly there with the question of the global climate crisis and the ways in which globality or our responsibility altogether is a question for me. Spiritual, I have a problem with because it's all over the place in the well-being world. It's, being sold to people as a kind of vague spirituality in the ethos of well-being and the way in which Eastern religions that are sort of reified and commodified. So I'm not sure that I'm going to go in the spirituality direction for that reason. And I don't know that I would go in the meaningfulness direction either, because I actually do take seriously the problems that people have in their bodies and the symptoms that they have as real. Doesn't mean that you don't solve them psychoanalytically by simply meeting and speaking to one another, but I actually consider them real. And I don't think that it's simply a need for meaning or for spirituality or for psychology. So one of the things I was mentioning about the fact that there's something about Western medicine that isn't just its failure because it doesn't understand the problems that people have in their lives and their lack of either spirituality or meaning, but the fact that it just doesn't understand. So the fact that they just discovered now that glia cells, that there's an immune problem in the brain is actually real. I mean, that stress manifests in a real way, which we already know. We know that people who are stressed actually can have more heart attacks or get sick more easily. And we know that, like, in analysis, whatever analysis does, it changes something on the level of the body. And so this conference in particular that's on bio psyche and, bio and psyche, I actually really want to take the body seriously in that level and ask about it today. And I worry that discourses on spirituality lose that. I mean, that's my.
If I may just respond, I appreciate what you're saying. I think we have to define what spirituality is. You started with religion, and I certainly separate those two as what I'd consider spirituality. A sense of belonging, a sense of the sacred, a sense of community. Those are things that I consider part of the spiritual importance of life. And you got to have some faith.
Charles, I want to just kind of cut to Kara's question, which I think might like augment a little bit. Kara, you asked a little.
I'm a dominating meal. I'm sorry.
I didn't catch that last bit that you just said, but
All right,
I'm gonna just continue to say what Kara's question was, which is, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. But okay, so or if you'd like to say it yourself, Kara.
It wasn't a question so much as a response to Charles, which was saying that I think people can find the spiritual in language and the body speaking the symptom. And yeah, that's all.
I agree. I mean, I even think of the Brooke knows this because I went on and on about it in class, but Freud's phylogenetic fantasy, this connection to the kind of history of mankind going all the way back to the Ice Age, I find, I don't know, I find it very comforting in a way to think of the difficulties that we have as, transcending time and place in that way. And the sense of, getting outside of the myopia that we all have with respect to our problems. Every single one of us, is very narcissistic with respect to our suffering. The way in which psychoanalysis trans-historicizes that and trans-individualizes it, I think is really important.
I think we're kind of running down on the last little bit here. I don't know if anybody has a final kind of question they'd like to get in. Lily asks, or Lily is commenting, psychoanalysis as trans-individualizing. Lily, do you want to?
Yeah, no, it's a dumb comment meant for the text so that everyone can just read it quietly. But I was just saying that I'm interested in that idea of psychoanalysis as trans-individualizing, as actually bringing us out of a sort of insularity of individuality. And I really hope that's true.
I think if we're doing our job, it's true. No, and I really I want that trans-individualizing and even sort of deep historicizing to be something that starts with the body, that the impact that you feel on the level of your body is understood, first as a real symptom that is situated there. And I think that, if that's spirituality, great. I'm all in the spiritual boat. Good. If that's nature, or if that's, sort of having a more natural relationship to the world, great. but each person is different,
Yeah. Also just thinking about spirituality of like through the phylogenetic of like cells having a memory or having this spirituality, that something could be maybe both real and spiritual, like that the physicality of the body would also contain this ridiculous memory of evolution in past times.
Rowan, you want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you so much for this talk. I have a question related to at what point you say to somebody, here's where I stop as an analyst, and I suggest you seek this kind of help. And so I'm thinking here about 12-step groups, particularly because this is where something I've been thinking about, where maybe the limitations is the kinds of structures of narrative that are framing people's ability to tell their stories and be recognized within a group setting. And so, I mean, I'm trying to think about at what point someone says, or you specifically, Dr. Webster, at what point you say, okay, this is the point where this one-to-one relationship requires a kind of non-professional or otherwise group facilitated engagement.
It's really case by case, I would say. The interesting thing is that once the analysis is taking hold, I don't know what I mean by that, but I mean a certain kind of process, you're not going to mess with it. And so I wouldn't probably in that place recommend, but I can't say, you can't, there's no rule that you can say that applies universally, but I guess I would be hesitant because you'd really be introducing something iatrogenically into the process. But there's a million times that I mean, obviously not a million, but there's been plenty of times in which in the beginning parts of treatment, which can be the first year, can be the first 5 years, you don't, this is not gaugeable. I've suggested the possibility of AA or any of the anonymous groups in conjunction with staying in analysis with me. Because I understand how well that framework works. I mean, one of the only place that I get worried about it is that it can make people really guilty. But that's fine. Analysis can pick up at that place. They were guilty already. It's not like it makes them guilty, but it can kind of like exacerbate the guilt that's already there. And that's just, you just keep going with the analysis. But it's interesting because there might be the necessity for the group in the early stages, but I also see people towards the end move towards group. Whether this doesn't have to be group therapy, but it can be other kinds of groups and other kinds of putting themselves in groups that they weren't able to do early on. It's funny, it can be there at the beginning, it can be there at the end.
I think we're just about out of time. We're at our time limitation. Thank you. This has been really wonderful and the questions have been really wonderful. So thanks everyone for participating and talking in the breakout rooms. And I'm remain obsessed with Eileen Miles now in a new way. So that's all I have for everyone. But thank you everyone, and thank you so much, Dr. Webster.
Thank you. Thank you for that poem. I have to go look it up right away, Alana.
I'm almost like, is it the solution? Not that there's, you know what I mean? But
No, I love the idea of her like pushing the sexuality into the Shakers because they didn't have sex, they ended, right? They couldn't, they couldn't.
It's so funny. So I'm sitting here and this is like up on my wall. Some kind of weird coincidence that this is like a marriage gift that I was given from my college roommate. And it's like the second I am Ann Lee, I thought that would be a good place to start. I am Eileen Miles. I am 67 years old. I have not had sex since February. And then goes on to say, Ann Lee thought that she was the church. Get it? An edifice. And that is a radical thought, not being cast as a thing. The live woman expanding out. Jesus was the church and she was the church. She was the second coming, and now God was complete, being both woman and man. It's so important that she had those 4 miscarriages and never proved to lay an egg correctly, and convinced her blacksmith husband not to lay eggs with her. People chuckle when you say Shakers, when you remind them that they were celibate. How did they reproduce? Well, they adopted, they recruited, foundlings. The fact that you don't have to breed to survive is inspiring to me. Or maybe it's so you won't have to die right away. Ann Lee could have kept trying, and one of those pregnancies might have had a baby, and one of them would kill her. Not now. I won't survive, but my church will, my work. That it was thought up or furthered by a woman who was not barren or infertile, but generative. I am Eileen Miles. I am not celibate. I love the place where the Shakers landed in this productive, generative scheme, which is the thought to make things and make things well. It's such a beautiful thought. I won't dwell on my own sexuality too much, but I do want to say, I love the idea of making something with another human being. Not a baby, but something nice. A special place, perhaps. But for now, I'm loving the solo place of life, the solo place of the life well made. I was walking on the beach and I thought, what about one blue stone? And I picked it up. I've had all this crap in my pockets, tokens of this and that, and I'm ready to whittle it down and examine my own message and my own time. I'm holding this rock with that thought. And that's it. But I mean, I don't know, man. I think it was like, I'm pretty sure, I don't know.
I'm pretty sure too.
Yeah, I don't know what to tell you. I was just like, and I'm like, it's literally coming at me from the side. So anyway, I'm jazzed.
I have like a long-standing conversation with a psychoanalyst friend of mine, that the invention of the external womb is going to change. We're all like, he says, we're all just waiting for this, because then reproduction becomes reproduction, creation becomes a completely other strange question that maybe will liberate something.
Yeah.
Entirely. And we're afraid of it and we want it so bad. And
Yeah.
so, no, I think it's all there.
Yeah. Anyway, call Eileen Miles. The book actually itself is quite, it's like really contemporary with yours, I think. Came out just about the same time and is kind of responding to some of the same stuff. So I think maybe
And
kind of
you would think that she wrote it during the pandemic. I haven't had sex since
I know
2020, right?
I think she's been having a lot of sex though, because I follow her on Instagram.
Right.
And I see her with her girlfriend all the time. So, we're being recorded. So hopefully Eileen Miles doesn't see this, but if Eileen Miles sees this, I respect your Instagram and I made an assumption about it. I'm sorry.